Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Haddon. I'm the VP for Thought Leadership and Client Communications here at Schneider Electric's sustainability business. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Toby Heaps, CEO of Corporate Knights. We're talking about the upcoming release of the Corporate Knights Earth Index, which is a first of its kind. And I'm really excited to get into it today with Toby and learn more about the Earth Index and its purpose. So, Toby, maybe we can start there. In fact, what is the Earth Index and um, why is it important? Why are you choosing to publish it now?
Sure. So the Earth Index is the fundamental metric in its purest form that tells us if we're going fast enough to meet the climate commitments that we've made. So we're measuring countries using their own numbers and their own commitments and looking to see if they're moving fast enough in terms of their emissions reductions to be on pace to hit their targets by 2030. So if a country gets 50%, it means they're going half as fast as they need to get where they said they were going to be by 2030. If they get 100%, then they're on pace to win the climate race. And some countries are also going in the opposite direction. So then you can have a negative score there as well.
And so, how did you go about developing the index? I can imagine that it was quite a process to collect the data that you did and, determine exactly how you were going to measure a country against their goal.
Yeah, originally we thought it was going to be a lot more straightforward exercise. We were actually really surprised that it's not being done already. There are a lot of indexes, emissions gap indices that are out there that measure policies and actions, but there's none that actually measures the rate at which emissions are being decreased year over year relative to the rate at which they need to be decreased to be on track to meet the target. And so we wanted to have as pure a discussion as possible about the speed and not about data sources and methods. So we use the data that countries publish for sort of the wealthier countries, the Annex 1 countries. They all publish data at an annual level in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They all publish the national inventories, usually about the middle of April. And in those inventories, they indicate what their total emissions are in a set number of categories that we are able to sort of harmonize and get common buckets for each country. And then for the countries that are sort of more middle income countries, we're just looking at the G20 countries that comprise 70%, make up 75% of global emissions. And then for the middle income countries like China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, we looked at the numbers provided through a European Commission database called EDGAR, which is a really reliable database. It's an authoritative database that has relatively current numbers for all countries, and we used their numbers to compile the indies. And so the key thing we were looking at is we know what the country's targets are by 2030. In some cases, countries have a net zero target by 2050. So we back out from where they are today to where they would be in 2030. We use just a simple linear assumption. So we assume that if a country had 10 years to reduce emissions by 10 tons, it would reduce by 1 ton every year, not all at the end, which sometimes is how people explain their lack of progress. And we checked with countries to see what their emissions trajectories were. In many cases, quite close to the linear projection. There's a little bit of an S curve, but more or less tacking to that linear kind of curve. And we used that to do a relatively simple sort of equation, looking at the rate of emissions reductions against the reductions required to be on pace to hit where they said they were going to be by 2030. And then we broke it down by 7 different sectors, the major sectors that make up the majority of emissions. The ones, the power sector, the transportation sector, the building sector, the industry sector, the oil and gas sector, the agriculture sector, the waste sector. And we looked at the trajectories for each of those sectors as well, again, making the same assumption, taking the current year emissions and looking at what the rate of progress needed to be to meet their targets by 2030. And we ran the numbers, and it was really interesting. Some great things are happening out there, but in aggregate, the G20 is, instead of moving forwards really quickly, is moving backwards kind of slowly.
And we've talked about just the importance of highlighting this gap. It's interesting because even in the last week, I've read a lot about some of the IPCC concerns that we're now off trajectory to limit global warming to just 1.5 degrees. Also read an analysis by the IEA that suggested that with our current commitments, we'll be able to get to 1.9. But it feels like part of what you're hoping to do with the index, and certainly what we're working to do with our clients, is to help close that gap between ambition and action. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's really what for us is really exciting, inspiring about this project. For a long time, the discussion with world leaders and corporate leaders, investment leaders was, here's what we think you should do. Here's the target we think you should have. And now we don't need to have that conversation anymore. 130 countries have net zero targets. $130 trillion worth of financial institutions have net zero targets. Most of the world's leading corporations have net zero targets. And so it's no longer about our target. It's about your target. And that those numbers you mentioned, those two reports are really kind of pivotal, because on one side, the possibility, if everyone did what they said they were going to do at the country level, we could be heading towards a sub 2-degree world, which is a much, much, much better world than where the IPCC report said we're on track for, which is a 3.2-degree world. That, and the gap between 1.9 and 3.2 is the difference between a relatively stable civilization and Mad Max. It's not a trade-off that any sane person would be willing to make, and it's something that is so it's, on the risk side it's huge, but then on the opportunity side it's like, well, we already have the people who are running the global economy have agreed publicly and put their word on the line that they're going to do this. We have the money. We have about $510 trillion globally of financial assets to deploy. McKinsey numbers indicate something like $9 trillion a year, $9.2 trillion a year. Only about 2 trillion of which are incremental spend. The other 7.2 are redirecting current spends, is required to pave the way to that sort of 1.92 degree economy that's within our grasp. Technology is on the shelf. We have the technology on the shelf. 90% of the cases, especially when we're talking about the big emitting industries and power and transportation, that technology is right there on the shelf. Industry, a lot of it, over 3/4 of it is right there on the shelf, required for the emissions reductions. And so we have the money, we have the solutions, we have the motivation, we have the commitments, and really at this point it's just about doing what we said we were going to do and following through on what we promised we were going to do. And the upside is a stable civilization, a relatively stable civilization, and a lot of prosperity, a lot cleaner air, and much more dynamic economies.
Yeah, thank you. From our previous conversations, that we're quite excited at Schneider about the publication of the index. Um, for anybody that doesn't know, Corporate Knights has really been such an important player in our space for many years because of the Global 100 Index and how that has really catalyzed action among corporations, Schneider among them. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about some of your other index work and the results that you've helped to drive, and then specifically what you hope will be the outcome of publishing the Earth Index.
Sure. For us, it's really fun to, a lot of people like to point out the problems and what's not working. And for us, it's really fun to sort of figure out what is working and to shine a light on progress. And so this index in its essence is what we're trying to do, is we're trying to shine a light on the progress that nations are making to delivering on the commitments that they've made to reduce their emissions. And we have amazing little examples of, in every sector, there's an amazing example where a country has shown that it's possible to reduce emissions quite quickly. Whether it's Germany in the most recent year for which data is published, reducing almost 50 million tons of emissions from their power sector in the transfer over to renewables, or the U.S., huge country, huge emissions, reduced their power sector emissions by almost 150 million tons in 1 year. So you have these examples where these massive shifts that people used to think were going to take 20 or 30 years are happening so much more quickly in some cases in 1 year or 3 or 4 years. And so you see all these examples, and it's really kind of exciting to kind of shine a light on, hey, this is possible, because if it's being done over here in Italy or over here in the US or over here in Germany, it's possible to do anywhere. And it's possible to do it at scale. And what we've seen with our other indices, like, for example, the Global 100 Most Sustainable Companies Index, is if you pick something and you have a pure intention where you're trying to really authentically track progress, and you pick metrics, or in this case with the Earth Index, a metric that is really tied to reality. So there's not a lot of daylight between the metric, doing well in the metric, and doing well in reality in this respect with atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide equivalent. And you do it on a consistent, persistent basis on a year over year, at least annually, then people pay attention, and people strive to do better, to raise their score. And people who provide capital start to pay attention as well. We've seen with the Global 100 companies, conviction investors, large institutional investors, pension funds, use the Global 100 as a bit of a cheat sheet to identify which companies they want to have larger positions in and go long, and give those companies the leeway to pursue some of these longer term, medium term investments that can put them on a plane for being much more competitive and low carbon. And I think this is going to happen with respect to sovereign debt. We're already seeing countries like Australia issuing reports, the government reports saying that they expect that there's a potential risk for their debt costs to rise by anywhere from 100 basis points to 300 basis points if they're an outlier and not meeting their climate commitments. And I think what we're going to start to see is we're going to start to see institutional investors who have their own net zero commitments taking a look at indices like the Earth Index, and for that to start to informing what the cost of debt is for countries. And when that happens, when the bond markets get on side in a meaningful way in the sovereign debt space, big things will happen quickly.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, certainly we have seen in our corporate clients just that same pressure of financial institutions and markets is playing a big role, in part because those groups are really waking up to the risks and potential costs of climate change, far exceeding any upfront costs that it will take to make this transition.
Yeah, it's the idea that Peter Drucker put on the table: what gets measured gets managed. It's true, and now that people are recognizing the risks and measuring the risks, and also the opportunity, I think the risks get a lot of daylight, deservedly so. But the opportunities, when you look at what's growing in the economy, because growth is really the source of investment returns. It's not the fossil fuel industry. We have a blip going on right now with the geopolitical situation in Russia, Ukraine, and it's expected that there'll be probably at least one or two more instances over the course of this decade where you see an upward tick in fossil fuel prices, and that will benefit fossil fuel companies. But there's nobody watching the energy transition closely that has any doubt about the long-term trajectory of the fossil fuel economy versus the low carbon economy. In the low carbon economy, whether it's electrification, electrifying almost everything, decarbonizing the energy grid, those trends are growing year over year phenomenally. Like, for example, as you probably know, last year, investments in renewable energy, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, rocketed up to $755 billion. And that was calendar year 2021. That's up 27% from the year prior. And this is in a COVID kind of situation. So the capital is flowing, the money is flowing, and if we can pour more money a little more quickly on the solutions, some magic will happen.
Yeah, that's really great. And I want to come back to something that you just mentioned in terms of the opportunities. And we certainly discuss this with our own clients as well, that it feels like many organizations want to get started. They they're getting that pressure, or increasingly they're starting to feel the moral imperative to take action. But many of them don't quite know where to start. And obviously, corporations and institutions in the public sector, like governments, have a critical role to play in these transitions. So I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about, what you are seeing as the challenges, but then what the real opportunity is that exists for all of us in this energy transition.
I think at its essence, what we need to do for this energy transition is pretty straightforward. Number one, we need to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to do it concurrently. We need to decarbonize the grid. So that's a lot more renewable energy. And there's so much renewable energy right now in the queue waiting for transmission. That's a lot more transmission as well. It's a lot more smart, localized storage and generation in buildings. But we need to decarbonize the grid, and we need to electrify almost everything. There'll be some things that green hydrogen fill in the spaces, and some long haul shipping, trucking potentially. But if we can decarbonize the grid and electrify almost everything, we're going to be well on our way to a low carbon thriving economy. And so where a company, when they look at, where can I help do this, companies are greening you see technology companies greening their energy supply, servers. You see companies looking to electrify different parts of their processes. You see homes, real estate using heat pumps. These are all technologies that are off the shelf, that are available in many cases with decent paybacks and less volatility. And also in many cases, they enhance the asset value and reduce some of the risks of the potential downside to the asset value. So investors, institutional investors are starting to get this, particularly in the real estate space. But generally, if you look at an average of the last 10 years and you look at the economic clout of the solutions providers, companies like Schneider Electric, like Ørsted, like Vestas, that are out there, and you look at their economic clout compared to the economic clout of the fossil fuel industry, the sort of traditional stalwarts of that, and you look at how they diverged over time, it went from a case where the solution providers for a low carbon economy used to be relative drops in the bucket, and today they're more akin to being the bucket, and they're larger by just raw economic clout than the fossil fuel economy players. They're growing much more quickly. They have much better long-term prospects. But what we don't see is their political clout having as much of a imprint in the way that the political conversation is going and the political policies are rolling out. There's still a lot more clout being exercised by the sort of sunset industries, and that's normal. They understand what there is to lose, and they're doing what they feel is necessary. Some of them are moving quickly to do transitions. Ørsted's a great example of that. Went from coal to largest offshore wind producer in a span of about 6 years. So some of them are sort of smelling the scent of opportunity and jumping on board in a pretty meaningful way, and others are holding things up. And I think we need the successful companies, the ones who have the most to win from the energy transition, to start to assert their political clout in a more coordinated way that can give the courage that's necessary for politicians to take the more urgent action at scale that's required for us to really do this build out. And we're starting to see that. And so there's lots of stuff to be optimistic about, but I think we really need to get focused and double down on making sure the economic clout of the solutions economy is reflected in the political decision making.
I would echo that. For the last 10 to 20 years, so much of action on the part of organizations has been voluntary. And now we're starting to see greater traction towards a favorable regulatory environment emerging all over the world. The new proposed SEC rule here in the United States, for instance, is really historic legislation. And while it will almost certainly go through many iterations before the final rule is published, we're getting to a point, I think, where regulatory environment and voluntary desire is coming together. And from my perspective, that's going to just be hugely powerful to really help us to make this transition. And to your earlier point, it can happen today with solutions that are existing today.
Yeah. And the people with the money, they're eager to unload it because none of these $130 trillion worth of financial institutions wants to have their word meaning mud. They want to back up what they said they're going to do, and they're looking for opportunities, bankable investments, good long-term private equity plays, and there's all sorts of creativity happening. And the creativity and the ingenuity of the financial sector is really coming to bear on this problem, and that gives the potential for us to take it up a few gears in really short order.
That's a great place to end our conversation today. Toby, thank you so much, and congratulations to you and your team on the publishment of the Earth Index. I can't wait to see how it drives real change.
Thanks, Amy. Pleasure, and take care.
Bye-bye.